Homesteaders, Gardeners, and Cooks. My name is Jennifer. Welcome to Miles Away Farm. Thanks for joining me in my kitchen. Today we are working on some canned tomatoes. And I've always said that if you are a beginning canner, the three things that you probably will try to can first are some kind of jam or jelly, applesauce, and canned tomatoes. Those are usually the big motivators for why people get into canning. And if you're growing your own tomatoes, that makes perfect sense, because when you have 20 or 30 pounds of tomatoes all at once, maybe you don't have enough freezer room to do anything other than put them in a jar. And it's also one of the most common items that is bought at the grocery store is canned tomatoes. And so canning tomatoes is a great way to decrease your reliance on the grocery store and have something absolutely delicious that came out of your garden in the middle of winter. A couple things that surprise people about canning tomatoes. One is the length of the time that you need to process them, which is typically 1 hour and 25 minutes for pints and quarts. That's a really long time. And it has to do with the density of the tomatoes themselves and how long it takes that heat to penetrate. You'll find slightly different times if you're packing in water versus you're packing in its own juice. I always can in its own juice, because why wouldn't you? But there is a little bit longer time for canning in its own juice, simply because that juice is more dense than water, and so it takes a little bit more time for the heat to adequately penetrate in order to make the product safe. The other thing that surprises a lot of people is the necessity for adding some kind of acid to your canned tomatoes. Tomatoes can range quite a bit in the pH, and that can depend on variety. It can depend on the weather conditions of the particular year that you're growing them in. It can also depend on your growing practices. And so it's not true that modern tomatoes are less acidic than heirloom tomatoes. It varies tremendously, and you can grow the exact same plants from the exact same seed packet in multiple locations in the country and have completely different pHs on those tomatoes. So it's really just variable due to conditions. You need produce to be under the pH of 4.6, and ideally, actually they really like it to be under 3.8 in order to be safe without having to add any additional acid. And so because tomatoes are so variable and they're kind of in that gray zone, that's why you add a little bit more acid to the jars. Usually what they call for when you do that is lemon juice. A lot of people dislike the flavor of the lemon in the tomatoes. You can also use citric acid. The nice thing about citric acid is that it's pretty much flavorless and it does not add any liquid to the mix, and so it doesn't make your jars more juicy, which is nice. But you do need to add a little bit of acid to your tomatoes when you're canning them. You can pressure can them. There are directions for pressure canning. They generally tell you to add the acid even if you're pressure canning, but they're telling you that because they never actually tested the pressure canning recipes without the additional acid in there. But you can pressure can tomatoes as well. By the time you heat up the pressure canner, vent it for 10 minutes, start your timer, and then turn it off and let it cool all the way down to where there's no pressure in it, and then open it back up again. It's going to take about the same amount of time as water bath canning, and so I don't typically pressure can my tomatoes. It's going to take a long time regardless. In terms of canning tomato varieties, you can can any tomato variety. They generally tell you to take the skins off. The skins are going to have an additional bacterial load just because they're exposed to all kinds of things, and so they want you to peel the tomatoes before you put them in the jar. And so that's part of the process, and I'll show you that in the video. You will not see tested recipes where the peel is on the tomato. And honestly, if you can them with the peels on, the peels are going to come off anyway, and they're just going to be floating around in the jar, and nobody wants to be eating that. And so it's just kind of a messy yuck. And so go ahead and peel the tomatoes. There's lots of different ways to do that. You can can any tomato. However, canning something like cherry tomatoes would be incredibly tedious because of all the peels. But you can can heirloom tomatoes. They don't have to be paste varieties or sauce varieties. I have an example of both here. So this is a sauce paste variety called San Marzano Redorta. This is a paste tomato from Johnny's that's just called San Marzano 2. Much difference in size. If I'm going to have to peel tomatoes, guess which one I want to can more of, because it's a whole lot less peeling. These guys. Or you can just can regular heirloom tomatoes. These are kind of average size. These probably weigh 6 or 8 ounces. They're about the size of a baseball. But you can can the big 2-pounders if you want. You're still going to need to peel them. And generally, the big heirlooms a lot of times have cat facing and scarring and things that you're going to have to cut away before you can put them in the jars. But I don't know if you can see it here in this jar. I've got some yellow and orange tomatoes in here as well as red tomatoes. So it was a little bit of a mix of paste tomatoes and heirloom, big giant heirloom tomatoes of all different colors from my garden. So it doesn't have to be a red tomato. It doesn't have to be a paste tomato. You can can whatever tomatoes you happen to have. You can leave the seeds in. Some people will take them out. My experience with America's Test Kitchen Cooks Illustrated, they did some taste testing on tomatoes, and they found that when the seed and that little gel pack that's around the seed was included with the dish, it actually had more flavor because there's a lot of natural umami flavor in those seeds. So I never seed my tomatoes. I just leave that in unless I'm making something like ketchup where I don't want the seeds in there. But when I can them, I just leave them in. It's totally up to you, though, if you want to go through that fiddly step of removing seeds. But yeah, this is a fabulous thing to have on your shelf all winter long. You can do other things with tomatoes, including, tomato soup and marinara and all of those other things that are grab and go. But in terms of absolute usefulness in your kitchen, I can cook this down into a tomato soup. I can cook this into a marinara by adding some Italian seasoning and some garlic and onion and maybe some pepper and make my own. This is, to me, the most useful staple in your kitchen. And so the vast majority of the tomatoes that I can, I just can them as tomatoes and then I run with them later. So that's what I'm going to show you today. Let's get started. So in order to peel these tomatoes, I've got my canning pot full of boiling water, and I'm just going to toss in a bunch of these tomatoes. I've got a bunch of different varieties here. Sorry for the framing on this. My camera wasn't set quite where I thought it was when I was filming this. A lot of people will put an X on the bottom of their tomatoes when they're doing this. I don't bother. I find the peels come off pretty easily, and I haven't cored them yet, and so I'm going to have to cut into them anyway. I give them about 2 minutes in a boiling water bath, and that usually is plenty. And I'm fishing these out one at a time because I have a second batch that I want to cook, and so I'm not just dumping those out. If you have a steamer basket, that can be really handy for this process. I have one, but I seem to never have it handy when I want to do this. And then on the heirlooms, I'm going to core them, and I'm also going to cut out any bad bits, any cracking, any cat facing. But you can see how easily these peels just come right off. If you've got a little bit of green shoulder on your tomatoes, the skin will sometimes stick to that portion. And I try to let that come off with the skin because it tends to not be quite as ripe. And I don't particularly want to can that anyway. You can see there's a little bit of a bad spot on the top of this one. And so I'm just cutting around that. And then cutting out that little crack that's there. And then that skin just peels right off. This is actually quite gratifying. It can be tedious, but it's also gratifying. There you can see how that's stuck. That's a little bit of that green shoulder there, and I'm just letting it go. So here's the last one from the first batch. Little tiny guy. And I'm losing a little bit of juice here, but not enough to be all that concerned with. I still have plenty of juice by the time I get these in the jars. And then after I've done with the second batch, I'm just going to dump my water. You don't need the pot. You can set that water aside and water plants with it. It's usually got some good nutrients in it. But I was going to reuse that pot for canning. So initially I'm going through here, and these little small ones are the paste tomatoes that I had. And so I'm starting out with the paste tomatoes. And so all the paste tomatoes are in the jars. And then now I'm starting with these bigger heirlooms, and I'm chunking them up into a reasonable size for the jar. For some reason, there's never canning recipes for diced tomatoes, and I don't know why that is, but canned tomatoes, obviously the tomatoes are going to vary tremendously in size from, a couple of ounces to a couple of pounds. And so I just cut things up into what I think is a reasonable size for getting them into the jars, which is usually, I guess, probably about an inch square. But I don't worry too much about it. And I'm cutting away a little bit more of some of the hard bits that are in here. Like there's a bit of core that's still a little hard. And I'm trying to, you'll see me kind of mix and match here. I'm trying to get a variety of different colors and flavors into each one of these jars. I have a pretty good sized canner, and so I can do 9-pint jars at a time. Most canners can only do 7. So I'm pushing those down, trying to remove air pockets and get as many tomatoes into these jars as I possibly can. There's a lot of air in tomatoes, and so you'll be surprised at how much juice to tomato pulp you get by the time they're cooked. You can also do what's called a hot pack. This is a cold pack that I'm doing here. A hot pack is when you heat everything first and then you put it into the jars. When you hot pack, it reduces the amount of air that's in the tomatoes and it gives you a little bit more per jar, and it also helps prevent siphoning, which you'll see a little bit of here at the end, but it's also a bigger pain in the butt. I've already got a lot of time and energy into these, just coring and peeling them, and so I tend to cold pack rather than hot pack. You want a 1/2 inch of headspace here, which is right up to the rim of that bottom rim on that jar, and so I'm just using some of the extra juice that's in this bowl to top these off as needed. Wipe your rims. We don't want any food on the rim of that jar because that will prevent the lid from sealing. And then I'm adding, I believe it's a 1/4 teaspoon of citric acid per pint jar. I'll put some numbers up here on the screen. And this is in lieu of adding lemon juice, so I'm adding citric acid instead. You can find citric acid at a well-stocked grocery store. You can also often find it at places that do cured meats because it's something that gets used in cured meats. So if you have a small butcher, you can find it there. And then this is salt. You don't have, the salt is optional. It's not required for preservation, but I really don't like the taste of tomatoes unless they've got a little salt added. So I like a little salt in mine. And so I just followed the directions for salt that are in the canning books. And capping and putting everything into our big canner. And the water in this canner is not boiling yet, so hopefully I don't get any thermal shock from putting room temperature jars into warm water. Living a little dangerously here. And I do love that this canner is big enough that I can get 9 pints in there. It's really nice. I had one jar set aside because I wasn't 100% sure that I'd put the citric acid in it. And so I wanted to make sure I could find it again. It turns out I did. Watching the video back, I did indeed. You want to cook these for 1 hour and 25 minutes because they're packed in their own juice. If it was just water, it would be a little bit less. You can see there's a little color to that water. That is a little bit of siphoning where some of that juice has come out from the top of the jars, and you'll see that here in a second with one of the jars as well. I did turn the heat off and then let this sit for 5 minutes before I started pulling the jars out. And see that one on the right and how it's leaking? I'm just going to set that back into the pot. 1, because it's going to leak in the pot and make less of a mess, but 2, because it's clearly not done siphoning, and I'm just going to leave it in there until it stops. So here's our finished jars. And you can see how much lower that liquid level is than where we started. That's really typical with a cold pack. And it doesn't mean there's any problem with the tomato itself. They're perfectly safe if the jars are sealed and you cook them for the recommended amount of time, but you are gonna lose some liquid during that process. And then I like to always pick up my jars without the ring, make sure I've got a really good seal before I store those in my pantry. Thanks for watching, Tribe. If you like this kind of content, give me a thumbs up, subscribe, leave me a comment, and share. I have new content coming out every week.